So throughout the entire course, we have been using MVVM. In fact, we could call the MVVM version that we have been using a vanilla version of MVVM, which means just plain simple MVVM, without any additions, without any frameworks, just plain and simple model view model. During this section though, I want to introduce the use of Prism. Now, Prism is this amazing framework based on MVVM that is going to allow you to implement the MVVM pattern in a much easier way and in some scenarios even in a more robust way. So using Prism is actually going to provide you with everything that we have learned about MVVM and even a little bit more. Prism is very complete. It's this framework that is available for us to install here on our Xamarin applications, and in fact it's also available for WPF, for example, and Universal Windows Platform, and it is really complete and easy to use. It is going to help you handle navigation, it is going to help you with modules, with events, and of course is also going to provide you with everything that you would expect from MVVM. The ability to have loose coupling, the ability to test easy your applications. In fact, using Prism is going to help you make your applications ready for unit testing. And just a quick note in here before we get started with Prism, there are of course some other frameworks out there that allow you to do something very similar based on MVVM, but Prism has been the most used for a while, so that's the one that I'm going to focus on. Now, in addition to being other frameworks that are similar to Prism, there are also some options for the packages that you will have to add. And it turns out that indeed, just like we've been doing with some other packages, we are going to be adding a specific package to all of our projects. Now, before we move forward to that, let me just mention that I have just created a brand new project that is going to be my Read Books project, where we're going to be able to save locally some books that we have already read. So in this simple new project that has no code at all so far, I'm going to add some packages. And the one that we are looking for is prism.unity. Now again, there are going to be some other versions that you can use, but Unity is pretty much the most used right now. So it's the one that I'm going to be using as well. Now you will find the Prism Unity Forms package. This is the one that you have to add to all of your projects. So once that package has been added, it's time to set up everything inside of the 3 projects that we currently have in the solution, so Prism is actually ready to go. The first thing that we will have to do is over in the app.xaml.cs file, which is to change the class that app is inheriting from. By default, you may have already noticed app is inheriting from a certain application class that comes directly from Xamarin Forms. But now we are going to be using a different type of class in here, which is going to be Prism application, which means that of course we're going to need a using directive to prism.unity. Now, before we go ahead and make the changes required in here, notice that, for example, the main page does not exist, these methods do not exist. I do have to change these also in the app.xaml because here we have the application, which is no longer the type that we're using. So instead of these, we're going to be using Prism application, and Prism application is going to exist inside of the Prism namespace. So you may have guessed it, I am going to need to add a namespace reference in here. So I'm going to write XMLNS Prism, and Prism is going to be pointing to that namespace that we also have already used over here in the C# file. And so it is going to be this Prism, the one that we use to access the Prism application. Basically the same thing that we're doing from the C# file, but from XAML. With this, some of the errors are solved. Now, I am not going to be using these 3 methods in here. And I'm also not going to be setting a main page just yet. In fact, the initialize component is not going to be called from the app constructor. It is going to be called from the overridden onInitialized method. So in here, is where I want the initialize component method to be called, which, by the way, is of course no longer coming from application, but from Prism application. So it's a slightly different method. Called the same way, but definitely different. I'm also, by the way, going to override the register types method, which is going to be now requiring an iContainer registry, and I'm not going to be throwing any exceptions from inside of it. And finally, the constructor is going to be different. I am going to need a constructor that is not precisely empty. The constructor that I need will have to actually initialize the Prism application as well, which means that the app is going to require an iPlatform initializer, for which I need and using directive to the Prism namespace, which is going to be initializer. That by default is going to be null, just in case no application is using this version of the constructor, but it is eventually going to pass that initializer over to the base. So basically what this means is that we have to update the call for the app method from both the Android and the iOS projects. You may remember how from the app delegate and from the main activity we call the app constructor, but no values are passed. So if we want to actually initialize the Prism application correctly, we will need to pass this iPlatform initializer, which is something that we are now going to have to do. Let's start over in the iOS version. So in the app delegate, I am going to be writing this same file, creating a brand new class right inside of the app delegate. So I am going to define a public class in here that is going to be the iOS initializer, which is actually going to implement the iPlatform initializer interface, which of course is coming from the Prism namespace, and which of course needs to be implemented. As soon as we implement the interface, we have this register types method that is going to be receiving an iContainer registry, and by the way, it's not going to be throwing any exceptions. And now, an instance of this iOS initializer is what we have to pass over to the app. Notice that here we have that call to the app constructor, currently not receiving anything, but we are going to be passing a new iOS initializer. And so now our iOS application is going to be using the correct version of the app constructor, initializing correctly the Prism application with an iPlatform initializer. Now, something very similar is going to happen on the Android project. So in the main activity, inside of the main activity class, I am going to create the Android initializer, which of course is also going to implement the iPlatform initializer interface. I need to add the using directive to Prism, and I need to implement the interface, make sure that it throws no exceptions, and make sure that from the app's constructor here in the main activity, I pass an instance of the Android initializer. So that easy, so far so good. We're just setting up the Prism application here, which is now the class from which app inherits. So now that we have finished up this initial setup for Prism, we are ready to start using it. In the next few lectures, we're going to be creating this My Redbooks application that is actually going to be using a quite interesting API for us to search for books based on ISBN or author or title and save them locally. Of course, we're going to be using Prism in this case, so we're going to learn how the views and the view models are going to be connecting, how we're going to be navigating between different pages, basically some of the basic things that we have learned throughout this course or that we have used in some of these applications, but now using Prism instead of vanilla MVVM.